In the expansive lands of Russia, where snowflakes often outnumber people, being black is akin to being the sole burst of color amidst a sea of white. Imagine this: Russia, with its staggering 144 million inhabitants, yet only a modest 70,000 of them sporting melanin-rich skin tones. It's akin to owning a Samsung phone in the USA standing out suddenly in a room. But here's the twist: the narrative of black individuals in Russia diverges from the typical tale of slavery and colonization seen in the USA, France, Portugal, Spain, and Germany. Russia's diversity wasn't cultivated through the chains of forced migration or slavery. The journey to Russia for black individuals was more of an invitation, but the reception wasn't exactly a grand affair. Fast forward to today, being black in Russia presents a double-edged sword. One wonders, will my skin color garner different treatment, or will I be embraced simply as the human being I am? In this video, we're peeling back the curtain on the untold reality of being black in Russia. Let's set aside stereotypes and delve into lived experiences, challenges, and moments that prompt the question, what's the true narrative here? Join us as we uncover the lesser-known aspects of a life colored by both the unique experience of being black and the complexities of navigating a predominantly white landscape. And, as a gesture of support for the channel, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to help us grow. Your support means the world to us. Before delving into the reality of being black in Russia, let's first explore the relationship between Russia and black people, and how black individuals found themselves there today. Unlike the United States and European counterparts, where the shadows of the African slave trade loom large, Russia's connection with people of African descent unfolds within the context of the Soviet era. Imagine the 18th and 19th centuries, a period when Russia stood apart, refraining from participating in the ominous trade and colonization of Africa that gripped Europe and America. In a surprising turn of events, Tsar Nicholas I took a moral stance by outlawing the trade of African slaves in Russia, despite the acceptance of serfdom and the enslavement of Africans elsewhere. Fast forward to 1895, another unexpected twist, when the Italian army invaded Ethiopia. Russia, recoiling at the attack on a Christian population, supplied weapons to Ethiopian troops, aiding them in defeating the Italian invaders. This historic moment not only showcases Russia's opposition to slavery but also its willingness to stand up against injustice on the global stage. So, how did people of African descent find their way to Russia? Unlike the grim narratives of forced migration, the story unfolds within a Soviet script. Picture Russians in the 19th century, donning a white gaze, viewing individuals from Africa not as sources of free labor but as exotic beings from distant lands. This perspective led to a series of ethnographic exhibitions in the mid-19th century, held in zoos, theaters, and circuses across the country, purportedly to share knowledge of African cultures but often serving as spectacles of difference. Transitioning to the era of communism in the Soviet Union, a new chapter begins in the story of black individuals in Russia. Communism, with its ideals of egalitarianism rooted in Marxist values, technically prohibited racism and discrimination. The Russian Criminal Code echoed these sentiments, outlawing and persecuting racial and ethnic discrimination. However, despite this legal framework aiming to create a society free from prejudice, biases persisted, particularly towards ethnic minorities like Jews. In summary, while the Soviet promise of equality presented a beacon of hope, the reality was a nuanced struggle between ideology and ingrained biases. Yet, when contrasted with the stark racial segregation and oppression faced by black Americans during the same period, the Soviet Union's pursuit of equality offered a glimmer of hope. In the 1930s, amidst rising racial tensions in the United States, numerous African Americans sought sanctuary in the Soviet Union, attracted by the promise of a more tranquil existence. The Soviet Union, with its professed dedication to eliminating racial inequality, became an appealing refuge for those exhausted by the systemic discrimination they encountered back home. The concept of a classless society envisioned by Marxist principles appealed to those desiring a world where one's skin color didn't dictate their value. Enter the Harlem Renaissance, a cultural and artistic movement that resonated far beyond U.S. borders. Leaders of this movement, such as Claude McKay and Langston Hughes, ventured to Russia where they encountered an unexpected reception. There, they were embraced as artists and individuals, provided with opportunities that had eluded them in their homeland. Amidst the heart of the Soviet experiment, these creative minds found acceptance and validation, an experience starkly different from the racial strife gripping the United States. While Russia offered a sanctuary compared to the US and Europe, it wasn't without its challenges, especially during the early Stalinist era. There were relatively few Africans present, but those who were noticed a sharp contrast between Soviet rhetoric against imperialist oppression and the actual portrayal of Africans in Soviet public media and discourse. Studies, such as Woodford McLean's examination of black students at the Communist University of the Toilers of the East, KUTV, in the 1920s and 30s, reveal instances where African students objected to depictions of blacks in Soviet media, such as the use of blackface in plays or racial epithets like monkey, reinforcing troubling racial stereotypes. Research on early Soviet children's books up to the late 1930s indicates that black people, particularly Africans, were often depicted as wild, animalistic figures, far removed from modernity. As the world grappled with the aftermath of World War II, the USSR once again opened its doors, this time welcoming a second wave of black immigrants, primarily from African nations. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union sought to expand its global influence, particularly in Africa, by supporting decolonization movements and offering various forms of assistance, including educational support. One significant aspect was the provision of scholarships for African students to study in the Soviet Union, covering a range of academic disciplines. However, it's crucial to recognize that the Soviet Union's motives weren't purely altruistic, they aimed to cultivate political and ideological allies. The treatment of black people in the United States, marked by racial segregation and systemic discrimination, contrasted with the Soviet Union's portrayal of itself as a champion of anti-colonial movements and racial equality. However, once in the Soviet Union, these students experienced everyday racism from various sectors of society. Tensions emerged between Soviet citizens and Africans, particularly African students studying in the USSR. While they received special benefits and opportunities, including government stipends and greater freedom, they were expected to return home after completing their studies and not allowed to remain in the USSR for extended periods. The disparities in treatment highlighted the complexities of race relations within the Soviet Union. Highlighted by the African-American writer and feminist Audre Lorde in her 1976 essay about her trip to the Soviet Union. Lorde noted stark differences in accommodations with some African and Asian participants in a conference housed in shabby hostels while she stayed in a first-rate hotel. These observations underscored the contradictions between the Soviet Union's purported anti-imperialist stance and the discriminatory treatment experienced by Africans within its borders in the period from the 1960s to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. African students in the USSR faced significant challenges, including racial prejudice and discrimination. These students often carried knives as a form of self-protection and recounted experiences of being subjected to racial slurs by their Soviet classmates. The case of Edmond Assar-Adu and the subsequent protests by African students in Moscow in 1963 highlighted the challenges and contradictions faced by African students studying in the Soviet Union during that period. The incident brought attention to issues of racism and discrimination within Soviet society. The narrative propagated by the Soviet government about its commitment to racial equality. Edmond Assar-Adu, a Ghanaian medical student, was found dead under disputed circumstances. African students alleged that he had been murdered, pointing to the unlikelihood of him venturing into a remote area where his body was found. They claimed that the motive behind the alleged murder was his relationship with a Russian woman, which they believed had provoked a violent response. The official Soviet explanation, however, attributed Assar-Ad's death to freezing in the snow while intoxicated. The autopsy conducted by Soviet medics with observers from Ghana concluded that the cause of death was an effect of cold in a state of alcohol-induced stupor. The conflicting narratives fueled suspicion and frustration among the African student community. In response to Assar-Ad's death and the perceived lack of justice, African students organized a protest on Moscow's Red Square on December 18, 1963. The protest attracted between 500 and 700 participants who carried placards with slogans such as Moscow Center of Discrimination, Stop Killing Africans, and Moscow a Second Alabama. The use of the term a Second Alabama drew a parallel between Moscow and the racially segregated southern United States, emphasizing the African students' perception of racial discrimination in the Soviet capital. The protesters marched to the Sparsky gates of the Kremlin, where they posed for photographs and gave interviews to Western correspondents. The Soviet response, as conveyed by the TASS news agency, expressed regret over the disturbance of public order in Moscow streets and emphasized the resentment of the Russian people towards such disruptions. This official response downplayed the concerns raised by the African students and sought to portray the protest as a foreign disturbance rather than an expression of internal dissatisfaction. The death of Edmund Asar in 1963, with rumors suggesting it was connected to his interracial romance with a white Soviet woman, highlighted underlying tensions surrounding relationships between African men and Soviet women. Despite the prevalence of such relationships during this time, interracial romances and particularly interracial sex were stigmatized both during and after the Soviet era. Harold D. Weaver's experiences as a Black American in the 1970s underscore the existence of sexual escapades between African men and Soviet women, contributing to racial strife between Soviets and Africans, especially the assumption that African men were seen as violators of white women. This phenomenon demonstrated that anti-racist ideology in the Soviet Union had its limits as it replicated long-standing Western stereotypes about black men. Research by sociologist Charles Quist-Aad in the late 1980s and early 1990s shed light on the racist undertones of Soviet views on interracial romances between Soviet women and African men. These relationships faced public and private hostility, with Soviet women involved being labeled as prostitutes and enduring shame from their families and communities. The treatment of Soviet women who became pregnant with mixed-race children was particularly distressing. They reported facing pressure to terminate pregnancies or give up their children for adoption to ease their lives as a rule. Soviet women were not allowed to follow their African partners to their homes on the African continent. Those who chose not to terminate their PR relationships often had to raise their children alone with minimal social support. Heartbreaking testimonies include stories of childhood ostracization in school, enduring name-calling, and feelings of rejection throughout their school years. Yena Konga, an AFR Russian television presenter and producer, shared her experiences on NPR, recounting feelings of isolation and loneliness among her Soviet classmates. She revealed that even her Russian boyfriend referred to her as his little monkey, using a racialized term of endearment in the Soviet Union. The portrayal of Africans as wild in Africa as a dangerous place further intensified feelings of isolation among the African community. A notable example is the 1970 Soviet children's cartoon Kotaro featuring the song Chuno Chuno, which depicted Africans as jet black, almost inhuman figures communicating with wild animals. The lyrics of the song included the stanza, "Chew coconuts and eat bananas," reinforcing harmful stereotypes and potentially engendering negative feelings toward Africans. The privileges granted to African students and visitors, such as scholarships and access to foreign goods, at a time of scarcity for the general population, fueled public hostilities. The sentiment of resentment emerged, questioning how these individuals could live better than the local population when they were perceived as underdeveloped. The fall of the Soviet Union indeed marked a significant shift in global geopolitics, and its dissolution had complex implications for various aspects of society, including international relations and the treatment of different ethnic groups. In the post-Soviet era, Russia faced numerous challenges as it transitioned to a new political and economic system, and issues related to race and ethnicity became more pronounced. The 1990s and 2000s in Russia witnessed economic hardship, political instability, and social upheaval. During this period, there were instances of xenophobia and racism, with attacks on individuals from different ethnic backgrounds, including black people. Hate crimes and discriminatory practices became a serious concern, and there were reports of violence against migrants and minorities. They became targets of anger directed at the defunct Soviet system. Incidents of beatings, verbal assaults, and even murders of Africans and other visible minorities surged. The 2010s witnessed a harrowing period in Russia for visible minorities, with stabbings and physical assaults becoming commonplace in major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. Respondents in Charles Quist AADS research reported harassment in the streets and false accusations of having AIDS due to their mixed race status, despite the challenges and risks. Africans continued to migrate to metropolitan Russian cities during this time, and many were drawn by the hope of finding work and economic opportunities. While others sought refuge from conflicts and instability in their home countries, as you mentioned, the possibility of receiving refugee status in Russia was limited, and the country did not have a comprehensive legal framework for addressing the needs and rights of refugees and migrants. The experiences of Africans and other minorities in post-Soviet Russia were varied, and while some individuals found opportunities and acceptance, others faced discrimination and hardship. In the present day, Africans and AFR Russians continue to decry racism and discrimination, facing challenges ranging from racial slurs to housing discrimination. The 2020 incident involving Roy Iyengar, a Congolese student studying economics at Bryan State University, sheds light on the pervasive issue of racism faced by African students in Russia. The video of the taxi driver refusing to take Roy based on his race garnered attention, revealing not only the discriminatory behavior of individuals but also the challenges faced by African students in Russian society. In the video, the taxi driver openly admits to being racist, stating that he won't give a ride to someone he doesn't like. This incident is not an isolated one, according to Roy, who mentioned that such discriminatory treatment is a common occurrence not only for him but for other African students in Brooklyn as well. Roy's decision to document the incident and share it on social media reflects an attempt to draw attention to the systemic racism faced by African students in Russia. The response from the Yandex taxi company, which swiftly apologized to Roy and dismissed the driver, indicates an acknowledgement of the severity of the issue. The company's stance that rude or racist drivers have no place emphasizes a commitment to maintaining a non-discriminatory environment within its services. However, the incident also highlights the broader challenges faced by African students in Russia, particularly in smaller cities like Bryansk. Roy's experience of being denied entry to a cafe based on stereotypes and prejudices about previous incidents involving other African individuals demonstrates the persistence of racial profiling and discrimination. Roy's observation that Moscow feels different from Bryansk underscores the regional variations in attitudes and experiences of racism within Russia. While Moscow may be more cosmopolitan and diverse, smaller cities might lack exposure to cultural diversity, contributing to a lack of understanding and acceptance of individuals from different racial backgrounds. The fact that Roy, who lived in Congo before coming to Russia in 2017, had never encountered racism until arriving in Russia highlights the contrast in societal attitude. The feelings of being dehumanized and constantly scrutinized based on race can take a toll on individuals, as Roy expressed his frustration and the stress caused by such experiences. The incident also brings attention to the online response, with some social media users expressing support for Roy, while others responded with racist insults. This dichotomy reflects the broader societal divisions and the challenges of addressing deep-seated prejudices. There's also the case of Isabel Castillo, another AFR Russian living in the country. Isabel Castillo's experiences provide a poignant glimpse into the complex and deeply ingrained issue of racism in Russia, shedding light on the challenges faced by individuals of mixed race. The lingering effects of Soviet-era prejudices and the broader dynamics of discrimination within the country. Growing up in Seykolynsk, Isabel faced daily discrimination and bullying at school due to her visibly different skin color. Despite attending one of the best schools specializing in math and physics, she felt isolated and unable to stand up for herself. The racial taunts and stares she endured became a daily ordeal, making her dream of relocating to a place where she could blend in without being constantly reminded of her differences. Her move to St. Petersburg provided some relief, allowing her to experience a more diverse and accepting environment. However, as she entered the workforce and sought accommodation, Isabel encountered racism again, particularly in Moscow. The discriminatory practice of landlords explicitly stating slaves only in rental advertisements reflects the prevalence of racial biases even with a valid permit to live in Moscow. Isabel faced skepticism from landlords who doubted her ability to pay rent based on her name. This illustrates how racial stereotypes can impact very serious aspects of life, including access to housing. Her strategy of meeting landlords in person to dispel preconceived notions highlights the burden individuals of mixed race often bear to prove their normality and reliability. Isabel's narrative also delves into the historical context of her parents' union, a union that faced opposition and harassment in the 1980s Soviet Union. Her mother of Sakhalin and island origin and her father from the Dominican Republic faced discrimination and negative consequences for their interracial marriage. The university's reaction downgrading her mother's academic achievements and treating her as an enemy of the people underscores the deeply ingrained prejudices that persisted in Soviet society. Furthermore, Isabel touches upon the broader issue of racism in Russia, particularly in attitudes toward people from the former Soviet republics. Many individuals from these regions face discrimination, and the fear of protesting, often exacerbated by precarious legal status, prevents them from challenging these injustices openly. Today, the United States and Europe have experienced significant issues related to police brutality, racial profiling, and systematic racism against black people, leading to widespread protests and calls for justice. When comparing these situations to Russia, the lower number of black people in the country, approximately 70,000 in a population of over 144 million, might contribute to fewer visible protests against racial discrimination. Some black individuals in Russia today may report little to no discrimination, suggesting progress towards a more inclusive society. However, it's essential to approach such individual accounts with caution, as experiences can vary widely and a lack of reported discrimination by some does not negate the challenges faced by others. Despite the smaller number of black people in Russia, the country does have a history of racism that cannot be overlooked. Acknowledging this history is crucial for understanding the complexities of the current situation and working towards a more equitable and livable society for all ethnicities. To move towards a discrimination-free society, Russia should take proactive steps to address any existing racial inequalities. This may involve implementing anti-discrimination policies, fostering awareness and education on diversity and inclusion, and promoting dialogue between different ethnic communities. It's important to recognize that achieving a truly equitable society requires ongoing efforts and a commitment to combating all forms of discrimination, even if they may not be as visibly pronounced as in other regions with larger black populations. This brings us to the end of this video. Tell us what you think in the comment section, as we are always interested in your thoughts. As always, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share our videos to let more people know the truth about blacks and hear their own part of the narrative. Thanks for watching.